Greetings, brothers. Again, I need to apologize for the inability to meet live, but it's just this last couple of months have just been really a challenge in that regard. So I appreciate your patience. I hope having these recorded videos has not been a hindrance for you in being able uh, to learn as I review these lessons. But I do want to just continue in where we left off last week in reviewing the assignment 3.11, which was the diagram and textual observations of the assigned psalm. And last week or last session that we had was the first part, and I focused on the first stanza of Psalm 99 with you. And I just want to do the second stanza, diagram the second stanza, and then we'll do textual observations. And as I mentioned before, I mentioned in the last session, there's no difference here in the diagramming process or textual observations. These steps are exactly what we've done before. It's just now applying them to the poetic genre. But we're looking for essentially the same things in the diagram. And just need to be aware of, as I pointed out last week as well, that being aware of because of Hebrew poetry being terse, the verses shortening, there's more elision, there's more removing of certain words that are still implied to be there. And often these are the conjunctions, the connector words, some of the connector words between the phrases and clauses. And so we have to really carefully understand the flow of the poem, the context of the poem, and what's being said, the parallelism, things like that will help contribute to an understanding of the relationship between these words and phrases and clauses. Because of again, sometimes there's not all the connector words are not there like they might be, say, in an epistle. And so we'll see that again as we look at the second stanza of Psalm 99 today. Um, Again, we're in the stage of diagramming the poem. So let me just go ahead and read the psalm to you, and then we will tackle the second stanza as far as diagramming. Psalm 99, the New American Standard Version. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He's enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he. Strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them. He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies in the statute that he gave them. O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God, and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God. Again, we take notice here I've separated each of the stanzas. We have the three stanzas, verses 1 to 3, verses 4 to 5, verses 6 to 9. And in those stanzas, notice they end with a refrain, holy is he, holy is he, holy is he, or holy is the Lord our God in the last case. And each stanza has a different focus. The first one focuses on God's greatness, that he's exalted. The second one on God's justice and righteousness. And then the third on really his mercy, his kindness, that he answered their prayer. He forgave them. And at the same time, brought consequences for their iniquities. All right. So, as I mentioned already, last session we diagrammed the first part of this first stanza. And let's remember the steps here for diagramming, constructing a diagram. The first is to identify the first independent clause. Really, I should put in the stanza. Then identify the remaining phrases and clauses in the sentence by, here's the key, by identifying or finding the connector words. And if you remember those, right, the prepositions, conjunctions, relative pronouns, participles. And then the third step is then state how each phrase and clause functions in the sentence. So now having identified each phrase and clause, where does that phrase or clause go? What word does it modify? And how does it modify? And then the last step is simply making the diagram, placing those clauses and phrases underneath the particular word that is being modified. All right, so again, this was done last session on the first three verses. The Lord reigns was a declaration. And then notice, let the peoples tremble. We recognize the relationship there, even though the word therefore was not in the text. That's the implied relationship. In response to this truth that the Lord reigns, therefore the peoples should tremble. Same in the second. He's enthroned above the cherubim. Therefore, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion. He's exalted above all the peoples. Therefore, let them praise your great and awesome name, because holy is he. So again, these highlighted conjunctions aren't in the original poem, but I think the idea is still implied. He's not just making random statements. He's not just saying, oh, the Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble, he's enthroned, let the earth shake. Those aren't four independent statements that have no connection. They do have a connection with each other. There's a statement, a declaration, and then there was an expected response. So that's why the therefore is here. And the same in the second line of verse 1. And really then the same idea in verse 2, that he makes a statement about he's great, he's exalted. So therefore the response should be, let them praise your awesome name. Why? Holy is he. Again, holy is he is not a separate statement that has no connection. So you have to think about, what is the connection? Is he just making another declaration that's in the list of declarations here, or is it linked in some way to what he's just said? And I think the link is, let them praise your great and awesome name. And by the way, we have a clue later in the psalm. If we look over here to the right on your screen, notice in verse 9, when he says, exalt the Lord our God, worship at his holy hill, so command. And then notice he does put a conjunction for holy is the Lord our God. So he does indicate there the reason why we should exalt and worship. And so I think even though that conjunction for is not in verse 5 or verse 3 when he says holy is he, it's still, the idea, I think, is still implied to be there. Okay? And I think we have justification because he does put the conjunction in that last refrain to show us that concept is there, that connection is there. The basis, the reason we exalt and worship is because or for holy is the Lord our God. Holy is he, holy is he. Okay? So this was the diagram for the first stanza. So in this session, I want to just diagram the second stanza. I won't do the third one. Maybe I'll put the third one in your notes, but I won't do it here. I'll just go through the second one. All right, so let's look at that. It's these two verses. The strength of the king loves justice. You've established equity. You've executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. All right, this is the second stanza. And so now we want to identify what's the first independent clause here. All right, well, we just look for an independent clause in the main subject and verb. The strength of the king loves justice. So I think the strength loves justice. Which strength? The strength of the king. Okay, but I think that's the first independent clause. All right, now we will notice other ones. You've established equity, I think, is another independent clause. You've executed justice and righteousness in Jacob is another independent clause. But at least we want to identify the first one. And then as we go through the stanza, I think we will see the other ones come out. All right, so we've identified the first independent clause. The next step is now, okay, identify the remaining phrases and clauses by looking for the connector words. And here's just a reminder, the conjunctions. Remember amboy, and, nor, but, or, yet. Those are coordinating conjunctions. Those are the 5. And then we have the subordinating conjunctions, which there are more of those. For, since, so that, if, though, therefore, because. So we'll take a look at those prepositions. The 9 most common are at, with, in, for, from, by, on, of, and to. And then we have the relative pronouns, the who, which, sometimes that. And then the participles, those challenging ones, the verb with an ing ending, which is not functioning as a noun or a regular verb, but it's actually as a participle. And so we'll see if we can find any of those as well. All right. And then sometimes punctuation can be helpful in identifying the divisions. So as I already noted, so what we're going to do now is just look through and see, can we find any connector words here? So verse 4, the strength of the king loves justice. Well, the word of, that's a preposition. You've established equity. No connector word there. You've executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Okay, so there's a couple of them. Here we have and, which is a coordinating conjunction. And then we have in, which is a preposition. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at, there's a preposition, his footstool, holy is he. All right, so we only have 4 connector words here. Again, there may be some other ones that are implied but are not written explicitly, again, given the nature of Hebrew poetry. So we'll just keep that in mind as we consider this particular passage. Okay, so that said, let's now move to the next step. We've identified the different other phrases and clauses by looking for the connector words. All right, now we want to state, how does each phrase and clause function? So what I typically do then is, once I identify the connector words, now I break it up. All right, the strength of the king loves justice. You've established equity. You've executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at his footstool, holy is he. All right, so notice what we did there, broke it up by either the connector word, or again, we hit like the punctuation marks can be a helpful guide for us as well, where we have here a semicolon, which is a strong pause. And so there's no connector word after that, but it's a indicator from the translator that we may have another phrase or clause which follows. And so that's something we pay attention to. Like a period. A period is a strong, it's a full stop. And so we can take note of that. Oh, and I missed a connector word, didn't I? And worship. All right, so there's another. So there's 5 connector words here within the text. Okay. All right, next step is, now we want to identify what's the relationship with each phrase and clause. That is, how is it connected? Is it modifying another word? If so, how is it modifying that particular word? All right, so that's the next thing we want to consider here and take care of. All right, so with that, that's what we're doing in this step. Identify whether it's a phrase or a clause. And so as we go through this, we have the strength of the king loves justice. So now notice here, I mentioned before, the strength loves justice. That was a sentence, but we've got sandwiched between it this pesky little phrase of the king. Now, what's that doing there? What is the connection? How is it related to the text? Well, oftentimes we'll have these prepositional phrases or phrases, sometimes clauses, that are sandwiched inside of an independent clause or a subject and a verb, or a verb and an object, because it's modifying the word right before it. So the strength, and then he wants to specify which strength or whose strength. strength of the king loves justice. And so really, it should be something like this. All right. And I'll show you how to diagram that in a minute. All right. So the strength loves justice. That's an independent clause. Okay. Can stand alone. Now, what it means is we'll have to think about that when we're trying to interpret that. But it is an independent clause. Of the king is a phrase, right? So what's it doing? What's it modifying? It modifies strength, telling which strength or whose strength? Strength of the king. All right. Loves justice. You've established equity. I think that's another independent clause. All right. I think it's another standalone statement. It's making a declaration. In fact, he makes 3 declarations here. Another independent clause is you have executed justice. Now, and righteousness would be a second object of executed. Okay? You've executed justice and righteousness. Remember, and is a coordinating conjunction, so it's going to connect 2 grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses. In this case, it connects righteousness to justice. You've executed justice. Justice is the object of executed, and righteousness, a second object of executed. Okay, and then in Jacob. Now, normally that preposition in indicates a location, where. So this is a modify, it's a phrase, right? There's no subject and verb, so it's a phrase. It modifies executed, telling where. Where is he executed justice? And we could say, perhaps also could modify established. Where has he established equity? Where has he executed justice? In Jacob. Again, referring to Israel. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. All right. Now, here I think this is a clause. So the question is it independent or dependent? It could seem as a separate declaration, an independent clause, but I think it is really dependent. It's describing the result or the expected result from the first 3 statements. The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice. Therefore, exalt the Lord our God. So I think it modifies executed and established, and telling the result. So based upon the fact that you've established equity, you've executed justice, therefore we should exalt the Lord our God. And then and worship is a second command. Exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool. I think it's again, it too modifies. It's a clause. Worship is a verb, right? The subject is you. It's implied. Worship at his footstool. So again, I think it modifies executed and established, giving a second result. All right. And at his footstool, that's a phrase, modifies worship, telling where. Where do we worship? At his footstool. And then, as I indicated before, holy is he is not a separate independent clause, but I believe it is the reason. It is a clause. Notice the subject and verb. And it is a reason. I think it modifies exalt and worship, telling why. Why do we exalt and worship? Because, or for, holy is he. Okay? Holy is he. So, like I said, we really have to pay attention and think about each line and what the potential relationship is between those lines. All right? And so, let's say now you go through this and you miss that and you think, well, these are all just independent clauses. that's okay, but you're going to have to consider as you go through each line and ask yourself. And again, remember, by this point, right, we've studied the psalm quite a bit. We went through the poetic analysis and recognized, we discussed the setting and the structure of the poem. We've studied that. We've studied the parallelism of the poem. We've studied the imagery, the poetic devices. We have identified the stanzas and summarized them. Uh, and so at this stage, we are pretty familiar with the poem. And so I think, and I've considered the relationship, between the lines within the verse and then even between the verses. And so we need to think about, okay, as we go to each phrase or clause and consider that next line, what's the potential relationship between that line and what came before? Because again, knowing that at times the connector words, especially the conjunctions, may not be written explicitly there. And so, yeah, it is an interpretive decision, but hopefully at this point we understand the poem well enough that we can make those decisions with some degree of confidence. But again, if you miss it and you just keep on studying, and then at a later step, that insight might come to you. You might see, okay, I think there's a different relationship here. And so, in the case of this poem, in looking at it, I think based on the statements I made about what's modifying, and even though they may be missing particular words. So, for example, I would say uh, this should have a therefore next to it. Therefore, exalt the Lord our God, worship. All right, telling result. Just like above, if you remember, when we looked at the first stanza here, let me take us back to it. And we were looking at, right, the Lord is great, in Zion he's exalted. Therefore, let them praise your great and awesome name. And again, the therefore was not in the original text. It just was a statement. Let them praise your great and awesome name. But there wasn't a conjunction between them. But I think that's the implied connection. He's not just making a statement, let them praise. That command is in response to what he has just been saying about the Lord's greatness, that he's exalted. So, therefore, in response, let them praise. And then I already talked about the because or for holy is he. And that's the same thing, that last statement here in this particular stanza. I think we again have that implied for holy is he. Okay? So what is this going to look like as far as the diagram? Well, we have the strength of the king. If we remember that let me just slide this over a little bit. All right. So the strength and then of the king. Okay, which strength or whose strength loves justice? So what I do with this is because the strength loves justice, that's the sentence that got split up by this phrase. What I'll do is I'll just sometimes I may highlight the full clause there just so we can see it, and then I'll draw a line here. Okay, let me make it a little bit more distinct. I'll draw a line here to show the connection. All right, the strength of the king. So I'll put here of the king. That's indicating which strength or whose strength. All right, loves justice. You have established equity. We said that was an independent clause. You've executed justice, another independent clause, and righteousness. Again, that was a second object of executed. So we'll put that here underneath justice. In Jacob, that is where it was executed. So I'll put here where executed. Where you have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God. Now remember we said that's likely the connection is a therefore. So I'll put that in brackets. It's not in the text, but we're saying it's implied. So therefore, and I'll just highlight it, exalt the Lord our God. So this is giving a result, an expected result of what he said above. You've established equity, you've executed justice, therefore exalt and worship. Okay, that's the second command. Exalt and worship. So I've exalt the Lord our God. Okay, it's a result, and then we have the second result is worship. Second result. And then at his footstool, that tells us where. Right? Modifies worship, and it's telling us where we worship. All right? And then finally, as we said earlier, holy is he, that is, I think, modifying exalt and worship. And the implied connector word there is for or because. And so it's answering the question, why, the reason, holy is he. Okay? And I'll highlight that just to make that clear. Again, I put it in brackets because it's not in the original. But again, notice if we go to verse 9, which is the almost the exact same statement, and it does have the word for. Holy is the Lord our God. So I think that idea, this is just an example of, it's not in verse 5 here. We don't see that word for, holy is he, or we don't see it in verse 3 explicitly. But I think it's, again, if you just look at verse 9, he says it explicitly. So I think that that understanding, that link, that connection is going to be the same in verse 3 and verse 5. That holy is he is not just a separate declaration, but actually is connected to the commands. Why exalt? Why worship? Because or for holy is he. Okay? Now, if you have questions on that, feel free to, you can contact me if you want to ask questions about that. But that's the second stanza. And I won't do the third stanza, as I mentioned, just for the sake of time. But perhaps I'll put it in your notes if I can have the time to do that. Okay? Because I want to get to the next step. So after doing the diagram of the poem, the whole poem, we next want to make textual observations of the poem. All right, and that's where, if you'll remember before, where we really get down to re-examining in more detail some of the structural, or really the grammatical features of the poem. And then with the epistles, we had a list of 9 or 10 things to look for. We narrow that list down a little bit for poetry, so you don't have to look for as many things. These are the things that we look for under textual observations. After we've done the diagram, then we want to go back and examine the verbs, pronouns, and conjunctions, and then identify if any conditional clauses or purpose result statements. All right? So these are kind of looking for these specific details which reveal some of the grammatical features, the semantic connections within the poem. All right. And if you remember, let's just do a brief review, especially the verbs. I think this is one where I see some of you guys need a little more direction on this, reminder of this. We want to identify, there's 3 characteristics of the verb in English: tense, mood, and voice. Okay. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So we want to examine the verbs and we're looking for tense, mood, and voice. Now, there are 2 kinds of verbs. If you remember, there are the verbs of action and the verbs of being. Remember, verbs of action, or the subject is doing something, and verbs of being, the subject is something. It's describing the subject. It's not, subject isn't doing an action, but it is being described in some way. So, for example, a verb of action, I hit the ball. That's an action. The subject I is doing the action hit. But in the second example, I am happy. Am is a verb of being. It's not an action, it's a state or a condition. All right? So he's describing the subject here. The subject's not doing something, the subject is something. In this case, I am happy. So here are some other is, was, will be, become. Those are other verbs of being. All right, so keep that in mind, those two classes of verbs. Now, both classes will have the three characteristics, the tense, the mood, and the voice. All right, so let's remind ourselves, review that a little bit. These three characteristics, tense, mood, and voice. Tense is when the verb happens in time with reference to the speaker. There are three tenses in English, past, present, and future. So just focus on those three. There are technically some other tenses, more complicated, but I just want you to consider those three, the basic ones, past, present, or future. All right? So past, I kicked the ball. I was happy. Again, I'm looking at a verb of action, kick, a verb of being here. So past tense, I kicked the ball. Present tense, I kick the ball. And future tense, I will kick the ball. All right. Verb of being, I was happy. Past, I am happy. Present, I will be happy. Future. Wish we could all say that all the time, right? But we do have continuous joy, right, in the Lord, despite our circumstances. We can say, I will be joyful, because that's not just an emotion. It's really a state of being, a contentment, a mindset. All right, but notice, by the way, the future tense in English is almost always indicated by the word will or shall. And past tense is often indicated, not always, by the ed ending. There are always some special cases, certain verbs that don't end in ed. But for the most part, that is the case. All right. Then we have examples here of mood. Again, remember, mood gives the speaker's attitude towards the subject. There are 5 moods. I really put 4 here. There's the indicative mood. If you remember, that's a statement. That's the reality. That's a declaration. There's the imperative mood. That's a command. The interrogative mood is a question. And then the subjunctive mood is a degree of uncertainty. It's a potential action or condition. Some would include the conditional mood. There, I tend to place that in a different category. So these are the 4 I want you to be aware of and identify: indicative, imperative, interrogative, and subjunctive. Let me give you some examples. All right, we have the verb of action again, verb of being. So indicative, I kick the ball. That's making a statement in the present tense. Imperative, kick the ball. Did you kick the ball? Interrogative, that's a question. I might kick the ball. That's subjunctive. The action is not known for certain. It's probable, possible. So a verb of being, I am happy. Indicative, that's making a statement. Be happy, that's a command. Are you happy? That's a question. I may be happy. That's subjunctive mood. Some doubt. All right. Another example. He preached the word. That's indicative. It's a past tense statement, but it's he preached the word. Action, verb of action. Preach the word. That's a command. So that's imperative. Did he preach the word? Interrogative. He might preach the word. He may preach the word. I hope he preaches the word. Those are subjunctive mood. All right. Verb of being. He is blessed. Indicative. Be blessed. Imperative. Is he blessed? Interrogative. He may be blessed. He might be blessed. That's a subjunctive. Okay. And then notice the subjunctive mood is often indicated by a helper verb. May or might or should or could, maybe, perhaps. These would be some ways to identify that. Okay. So that's the mood. So we have the tense, the mood, and finally the voice. That tells us the relationship of the subject to the verb. There are 2 voices in English, active or passive. Active voice, the subject does the action. Passive voice, the action is done to the subject. All right. So for example, in an action verb, I hit the ball. Subject's doing the action. So this is active voice. I hit. Passive, the ball was hit. So the ball is the subject here, but the ball is not doing the action. The action is being done to the ball. The ball was hit. Notice this verb of being is added there to indicate a passive voice. That's typical in English. You'll see a verb of being before the other verb. So was or be or am. So for example, in this case, we have the ball was hit. Verbs of being, active, I am happy. Passive would be I was made happy, something like that. All right. So voice refers to the nature of the verb in relation to the subject. Again, an active voice, the subject does the action. A passive voice, the action is done to the subject. Now in Greek, there is a third voice that I've mentioned in class. It's called the middle voice. We don't have that explicitly in English, but in the middle voice, the action, the subject's still doing the action, but it's doing it for itself, towards itself, or for its own benefit. Again, there's no middle voice in English, but translations will often use the himself or herself to reflect that. So, for example, I gave a gift, active voice. Subject I, verb is gave. The subject's doing the action. Passive voice, the gift was given. So the subject gift is not doing the action. The action is done to the subject. The middle voice, I gave myself a gift. So here that would sort of reflect that middle voice idea that I gave a gift, but I gave it to myself or for my benefit. Did the action to myself, for myself. All right. Now, when you do the identifying the verbs, when you do the textual observations, you don't have to include middle voice since you're looking at English translation. I'm just making you aware of it. So when we do deeper study in the passage. Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Pronouns. All right. These are words used in place of a noun. And there's a list of them: I, we, they, them, us, me, he, her. And then there's antecedent is the noun that the pronoun refers to. It's usually the nearest in proximity. And we'll see that in a few examples. So when we're identifying the pronouns, there's two things you need to identify: the person, the number of pronoun, and then the antecedent. That is, what does it refer to? So when we see a first person singular, that's I, me, or my, right? A third person plural, they, them, their. So when you identify the pronouns in your textual observations, you have to indicate, is it first, second, or third person? And is it singular or plural? So, right, first person would be referring to me, to I. Second person would be saying you, your. Third person is he or she or they or it, them, right? And then you need to identify what does that pronoun refer to in the text. And I'll show you this when we get to the example. Thirdly, you want to identify the conjunctions and when you do textual observations. And for that, I just want you to indicate, is it coordinating or subordinating? All right, what's it doing there, the conjunction? And then finally, conditional clauses. Right, normally presented by an if statement, sometimes an as, or though. Sometimes another word. Usually if is given there, indicating a condition. The action will happen if a certain condition is met. All right, right. For example, I will read the book if someone gives it to me. Okay. The action, the main idea is I will read the book. That's my main independent clause, but the action will not happen unless someone gives it to me. All right. That's the condition by that word if. And normally then when I diagram this, I will put it under the action because it's a condition of the action. Where we could say, if you repent and believe, you will be saved. Okay? So you will be saved is the main statement, the main clause here, but it's based upon a condition. If you'll be saved if you repent, and we technically could do it this way, and believe. All right. So I put it modifying the action here. It's a condition. Conversely, right? If you don't repent and believe, you won't be saved. So you will be saved only happens if you repent and believe. I will read the book only happens if someone gives it to me. All right. And then lastly, look for purpose and result statements. So look for those conjunctions, therefore, so that, because, for, um, where it's a particular statement is made as a result or a reason for something else. All right. So let's do this for Psalm 99. I've already read the text and I'll keep it to the right here. So let's just go through. I separate by verse, so we'll just go that way. Oops. Okay, verse 1. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He's enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. So just identify the verbs. Well, reigns, it's one verb. Tremble, is enthroned, shake. All right, and so we just want to take each of those reigns. All right, what's the tense? It's present tense. What's the mood? Indicative. It's making a statement. And then what's the voice? It's active, right? The subject's doing the action. The Lord reigns. All right. Tremble. Present. Imperative. Let the peoples tremble. So when you see that word let, it's an indication of an imperative. And again, it's active. Subject's doing the action. Is enthroned. Present, as indicated by the is. It's an indicative. It's making a statement. And it is active. Is enthroned. All right. Shake. Present. Imperative. Notice let shake. And active. Okay. Verse 2. The Lord is, there's my verb, great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. All right. Is present, indicative, active, is exalted. It's the same. Present, indicative, active. It's making a statement in the present, active tense. Now, let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he. Okay, praise. What is it now? Present, imperative. Notice the word let, and active. And then again, we have is, present, indicative, active. All right, verse 4. The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. So I would say loves, present, indicative, active, have established, past, right? It's something that has been done already. Past, indicative, active. And it's the same with have executed, past, indicative, active. All right, I'm just going to do this. Same. Okay. Verse 5, exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Okay, exalt and worship, I'll just put them together, are both present imperative active. And then we have is again present. I'm going to shorthand it, indicative active. Okay. All right, so you get the idea. Just go through each of the verses and do the identify the mood, the tense, and the voice. All right. And then I noticed the pattern here. Verses 1 to 5 are mostly in the present tense. The early part of the stanza is indicative. The last verse is imperative. So notice, for example, in verse 5, we had two imperatives, but verse 4 was all indicative. Verse 3 was an imperative at the end, and verse 1 and 2, there were a couple imperatives, but it was mostly indicative, 4 statements made. And then that's the same we'll find in verses 6 to 9. Verses 6, 7, and 8, mostly indicative, and verse 9, imperative. All right, pronouns. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He, there's a pronoun, is enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. So he is my only pronoun. It is third person singular and refers to the Lord right above it, right? It's not the peoples because it's singular. He is enthroned, so we know it's referring to the Lord. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted above all the peoples. Same thing. All right. Third person singular refers to the Lord in verse right before. Let them praise your great and awesome name. So your second person singular, and again refers to the Lord in verse 2. All right, verse 4. The strength of the king loves justice. You have established strength, equity. You have established justice. So you, second person singular, refers to the Lord. Verse 2. Okay. Verse 5. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. So we have our. So this would be first person plural and refers to the author and audience. So, all right, right, the speaker and then his audience would be included. His third person singular, and again refers to God or to the Lord, our God, in the line above. He, again, third person singular, refers to the Lord, our God. Okay? You get the idea. So do that for all the verses. Note with it's the number and the number of persons, and then also whether it's first, second, or third person, and then whether it's singular, plural, and then what does it refer to? Okay. Now we'll take a look at the conjunctions. So we're going to notice the conjunctions here in this poem we already talked about. So we have and in verse 2. So I would take note of that. Verse 2, and is a coordinating conjunction, and it's connecting the Lord is great with he is exalted. Okay. And praise your great and awesome name. Verse 3. Verse 3. And again, remember amboy, it's coordinating conjunction. And what is it connecting here? Connecting great and awesome. So it's connecting actually two adjectives together. Great and awesome name. Now, I put the 4 in here, so it's not in the text, so I won't include that in these conjunctions. It's only what's in the text. We have verse 4, we have another and, again, coordinating, connects justice, so that connects the two objects of executed, justice and or with righteousness. Okay, exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Notice we have a lot of these coordinating conjunctions. And coordinating connects the commands. Exalt with worship. Okay? So we just go through. I'll do verse 9. There's another one here. There's another and here. Another and in verse 6. Another and verse 7. And in verse 8. Verse 9. So I'm not going to go through those. But I will note, verse 9, we have the 4, which is a subordinating. It's not and, nor, but, or, yeah. It's not one of those. And it connects basically uh, indicates holy, it's the Lord, modifies, exalt, and worship in telling why. Okay? Or the reason. All right, so that's all you got to do is go through, identify the conjunctions in the text, and then what kind of conjunction it is, what it's doing. All right. All right. So the next, after doing that, so we've done the verbs, pronouns, conjunctions. Then we go and look, are there any conditional clauses in this psalm? And I didn't catch any in this particular psalm. No conditional statements. Then we want to do purpose or result. Well, we had a few of those, didn't we? Remember, we have the result, verse 3, verse 5, verse 9, the therefore. So I would put, verse 3, expected result is to praise. Verse 5, expected result is to exalt and worship. And really, that's the same thing in verse 9 as well. Okay? And then we have verses 3, 5, and 9 also indicate the reason to praise, exalt, worship is because holy is he. Okay? So those are purpose result statements that we see in this poem. All right? And then that's it. Those are the 5 textual observations to look for. The verbs, pronouns, the conjunctions, conditional clauses, and purpose result statements. And that's it. Okay, so after you've done the diagram, then do that particular step. And so we see that here we go to, let me pull up the assignment. All right. Here's the assignment. Again, the instructions. So I have the instructions to do the diagram and do the whole psalm. I just did a part of it as an example, but you need to do your whole psalm. and then make textual observations, looking for verbs, pronouns, conjunctions, purpose, result, and conditional clauses. And I just went through those with you. All right. And then I give you an example. This, again, this case was Psalm 128, which we did in class, um, where I do have to show you the diagram for that psalm and each of the steps, and then show you the textual observations. All right. So you got another example there, and then I give you space to do your assignments. Block diagram your passage, identify the first independent clause, then identify the other phrases and clauses. How do they function? What do they modify? And then make the diagram, and then textual observations. The verbs, pronouns, conjunctions, conditional clauses, and purpose result. Okay? And that's it. Now, just by way of reminder, um, I think I sent a message to our group, Facebook group message, but Module 4 will be June 16 to 20, Monday to Friday, third week in June. And that's where you will be preaching your assigned passage in Psalms, your assigned Proverbs passage, and then we'll be getting into the topic of prophecy, prophetic genre, which will be a lot of fun. All right, so just stay with these assignments, brothers. The fact that it is in June gives you a little more time, but don't use that to procrastinate. Just see that as a mercy from the Lord that you have more time, but get on it now. Get on these assignments. Stay with it. We still have some time. What is this? Toward the end of February, so you have March, April, May, June. You still have 4 months, but you need to recognize that's 2 passages you have to prepare for. So be done with the Psalm passage, I would say, by the end of March. So about 6 weeks. Finish the assignments for your Psalms passage and then move towards your Proverbs passage. You'll have about 8 weeks to complete that one. Okay? Well, I hope that's helpful to you. Assignment 3.11, diagrams and observations of your assigned Psalm. You'll do the same thing for your Proverbs text as well. Okay? And I hope that this was useful to you. And as always, questions, you can refer them to me, message me, email me, just let me know. All right. Again, brothers, I want to just wish you Lord's blessings as you continue to shepherd God's people and continue to dive into his word to understand it, not only to teach it, but to apply it to yourself. All right. Take care.